A church is meant to be a sanctuary, a beacon of hope and safety in a chaotic world. Its walls are supposed to hold the light of salvation, offering comfort to the weary and solace to the broken. But when those trusted to uphold that light allow darkness to creep in, the sacred becomes profane. Corruption festers, twisting faith into fear, and the very place meant to banish nightmares becomes the source of them. When humanity's flaws defile the divine, the line between good and evil blurs, leaving shattered trust and broken souls in its wake. Safety becomes an illusion. The woods around Lake Whitlock were dense and quiet, the kind of place where the sunlight barely pierced the canopy, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and distant bird calls. The Harper family had set up camp just off one of the main trails, eager for a weekend of peace and nature. 12-year-old Liam and his 14-year-old brother Jack weren't as thrilled. They had hoped for a trip to the amusement park, not a weekend with no cell service and their parents insisting on family bonding. But the brothers kept themselves entertained, exploring the forest, while their parents relaxed by the fire. That's when they found it. It was Jack who spotted the narrow, overgrown path that veered off the main trail. It led deeper into the woods, the trees thickening until the boys stumbled upon a clearing. There, hidden among the shadows of the forest, stood an old, abandoned church. The building was made of dark wood, its steeple leaning precariously to one side. The windows were shattered, and ivy crept up the walls like skeletal fingers. A rusted iron cross hung lopsided above the heavy wooden doors. "Creepy," Liam whispered, staring up at the structure. "Who builds a church out here?" Jack shrugged, his curiosity overriding his fear. "Who cares? Let's check it out." "Jack, no," Liam hissed, grabbing his brother's arm. "What if it's not safe?" "Don't be a baby," Jack said, shaking him off. "It's just an old building." They stepped inside. The air was stale and heavy, the interior dimly lit by the last rays of sunlight filtering through the broken windows. Dust particles floated in the air, disturbed by their footsteps on the creaking wooden floorboards. The pews were overturned, their wood splintered and rotting. A crumbling altar stood at the far end, draped in what looked like a blackened cloth. Strange symbols were carved into the walls, their jagged lines unfamiliar and unsettling. "What is this place?" Liam asked, his voice trembling. Jack didn't answer. He had noticed something near the altar, a circle of candles, their wax melted into strange patterns on the floor. "We should go," Liam said, tugging at Jack's sleeve. "Yeah," Jack agreed, his bravado fading. "Let's get out of here." That night, back at the campsite, the boys didn't tell their parents what they had found. They didn't want to get in trouble for wandering off. But as they lay in their tent, the image of the abandoned church lingered in their minds. "I bet there's more to it," Jack whispered. Liam groaned. "Forget it, Jack. It's just some creepy old building. What if it's not? What if it's like haunted or something?" Jack's eyes gleamed with excitement. "Let's go back, tonight." "Are you insane?" Liam hissed. "Mom and Dad will kill us." "They'll never know," Jack said. "Come on, don't you want to find out what's really in there?" Reluctantly, Liam agreed. They waited until their parents were asleep, slipping out of their tent and into the cool night air. The forest was silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves, and the moon cast eerie shadows across the ground. The boys made their way back to the narrow path, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. When they reached the clearing, the church loomed before them, more menacing under the pale moonlight. "Let's make it quick," Liam said, his voice shaking. They pushed open the heavy doors, the creak echoing through the empty space. Inside, the air was colder than before, and the faint smell of decay hung in the air. That's when they heard it, a low, rhythmic chanting. The boys froze, their hearts pounding. The sound was coming from somewhere deeper in the church, a guttural, otherworldly cadence that made their skin crawl. Jack gestured for Liam to follow as he crept toward the sound. They moved past the crumbling altar, finding a set of stairs leading down into the darkness. The chanting grew louder. "Jack! No!" Liam whispered, grabbing his brother's arm. "Let's just go!" But Jack shook him off, his curiosity overpowering his fear. They descended the stairs, the air growing colder with each step. The basement was lit by flickering candles, their weak light casting long shadows across the damp stone walls. And then they saw them. A group of figures stood in a circle, their faces obscured by dark hoods. They chanted in unison, their voices low and resonant. In the center of the circle was a large wooden slab, stained dark with what looked like old blood. Symbols like the ones carved upstairs covered the walls and floor, glowing faintly in the candlelight. The boys crouched behind a stack of crates, their breaths shallow as they watched the ritual unfold. One of the figures stepped forward, holding a small, writhing animal, a rabbit. They placed it on the slab and raised a curved blade. "What the hell?" Liam whispered, but Jack clamped a hand over his mouth. The blade came down, and the chanting grew louder. The symbols on the walls began to pulse, their glow intensifying until the room was bathed in an unnatural red light. The air vibrated with energy, and a low growl echoed through the basement, a sound that didn't come from any of the hooded figures. Something was in the room with them, The boys tried to retreat, but the stack of crates shifted under Jack's weight, toppling to the floor with a crash. The chanting stopped, and the hooded figures turned as one, their faces hidden in shadow. "Who's there?" one of them demanded, their voice sharp and commanding. Jack grabbed Liam's hand, pulling him toward the stairs. They ran, the sound of footsteps and angry shouts behind them. When they reached the main floor, the doors slammed shut with a deafening bang. The symbols carved into the walls began to glow, just as they had in the basement. "We're trapped!" Liam cried, pounding on the doors. "Help me push!" Jack shouted. The boys threw their weight against the doors, which creaked under the strain. The chanting had resumed, louder now, and the sound of the growl was closer. With one final push, the doors burst open, and the boys stumbled into the night. They didn't stop running until they reached the campsite, their lungs burning and their hearts racing. Their parents were furious when the boys burst into the tent, but the boys were too shaken to explain. The next morning, the family packed up and left, the boys relieved to see the forest fade into the distance. But the story didn't end there. A week later, the local news reported a fire in the woods near Lake Whitlock. A group of campers had found the remains of the abandoned church, charred and smoldering. Authorities suspected arson, but the strange symbols burned into the ground couldn't be explained. Jack and Liam never spoke about what they saw that night, but they couldn't forget the glowing symbols, the hooded figures, and the growl that haunted their dreams. And somewhere, deep in the woods, the chanting continued. Father Andrew's journey to Italy was supposed to be the culmination of his faith. After years of devotion, his elevation to bishop was a moment of pride, not only for himself but for his parish back home. The ceremony would take place at San Vittorio, an ancient cathedral on the outskirts of a small rural town in Italy. Nestled atop a rocky hill, the cathedral had stood for centuries, its dark, Gothic spires piercing the sky like accusing fingers. As Andrew's car approached, the sight of San Vittorio made his stomach tighten. The building was imposing, its stone walls blackened with age and soot. Around it, the countryside stretched into a desolate expanse of hills and forests. The driver, an old man with a grizzled beard, glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "San Vittorio is a place of history," the driver said, his tone cryptic. "And secrets." Andrew offered a polite smile, ignoring the unease growing in his chest. The townspeople greeted him with enthusiasm, though their smiles seemed too wide, their stares lingering a second too long. They spoke in hushed tones, their words a mix of reverence and something else, something darker. The cathedral was no less unnerving inside. Its walls were adorned with ancient frescoes, their vibrant colors faded into muted tones. The air was thick with the scent of incense, but underneath it lingered a faint metallic tang that Andrew couldn't place. Bishop Renato, the man overseeing Andrew's promotion, greeted him warmly. "Welcome to San Vittorio, Father Andrew. This place has served the faithful for generations." Andrew nodded, though his gaze was drawn to the massive altar at the center of the cathedral. It was carved from obsidian, its surface polished to a sinister sheen. At its base was an engraving of an unfamiliar symbol, a circle entwined with jagged, spiked lines. That night, Andrew stayed in the rectory attached to the cathedral. The room was sparse but comfortable. As he prepared for bed, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The windows overlooked the dark expanse of the countryside, but he thought he saw movement, a shadow flitting across the moonlit field. Dismissing it as fatigue, Andrew climbed into bed. Sleep came uneasily, plagued by fragmented dreams of the cathedral. In one, he stood at the altar as the congregation chanted in a language he couldn't understand. Their faces were blurred, and when he looked down, his hands were stained red. He woke in a cold sweat, the whispers from his dream still echoing in his ears. The next day was filled with rehearsals for the ceremony, but Andrew couldn't shake the sense of unease. The townspeople seemed too eager, their smiles too forced. As he walked through the cathedral, he noticed things he hadn't seen before, cracks in the frescoes that resembled screaming faces, and faint bloodstains on the obsidian altar, almost imperceptible unless the light hit it just right. "Is something troubling you?" Bishop Renato asked, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp. Andrew hesitated. "The symbol on the altar. It's not one I recognize. What does it mean?" Renato's smile thinned. "An old motif. It represents the triumph of light over darkness. Nothing more." But Andrew wasn't convinced. That evening, he explored the cathedral alone, his footsteps echoing through the vast empty halls. His flashlight's beam danced across the frescoes, casting eerie shadows. When he reached the altar, he crouched to examine the symbol more closely. The jagged lines seemed alive, writhing under the beam of his flashlight. He reached out to touch it, and a jolt of cold shot through his fingers. "Father Andrew," a voice said, making him jump. He turned to see one of the townspeople, an older woman with a hunched back and a vacant stare. "You shouldn't linger here at night," she said, her tone more warning than advice. "Why not?" Andrew asked, his voice trembling. She didn't answer. Instead, she shuffled away, her muttering too low for him to hear. That night, Andrew's dreams were worse. He saw the townspeople gathered around the altar, their faces grotesque and distorted. Bishop Renato stood at the center, holding a chalice that dripped with thick, dark liquid. Andrew woke to the sound of chanting. It was faint, carried on the wind, but unmistakable. He looked out the window and saw figures moving toward the cathedral, their lanterns glowing like fireflies. Curiosity overwhelmed fear, and Andrew grabbed his coat, slipping out into the night. He followed the flickering lights to the cathedral, staying in the shadows. Inside, the chanting grew louder, filling the air with a deep, resonant hum. Peeking through the door, Andrew's blood ran cold. The congregation was gathered around the altar, but their behavior was far from holy. Their chanting was guttural, almost animalistic, and their movements were erratic, as if driven by unseen forces. Bishop Renato stood at the altar, his hands raised high. The obsidian surface glowed with a sickly red light, and the symbol at its center pulsed like a heartbeat. In the center of the altar lay a goat, its throat slit, blood pooling and dripping onto the floor. Andrew stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He turned to leave, but the sound of a footstep behind him froze him in place. "You've seen too much," Renato's voice said, cold and devoid of its usual warmth. Andrew spun around to see the bishop standing there, his face illuminated by the eerie red light. "Why are you doing this?" Andrew demanded, his voice trembling. Renato tilted his head, his eyes gleaming with something inhuman. "San Vittorio has always served a higher purpose, Father Andrew. We do not pray to your God. We serve the one who answers." Andrew's stomach churned. "You're sacrificing in his name?" "Not sacrifice," Renato corrected, stepping closer. "Offering, for protection, for power." The congregation began to turn, their faces twisted into monstrous parodies of humanity. "You were meant to join us," Renato said, his voice low. "But now, you'll serve another purpose." Andrew bolted, running through the cathedral and out into the night. The wind howled, and the trees seemed to close in around him. Behind him, the chanting grew louder, a cacophony that filled his ears and made his vision blur. He didn't stop until he reached the edge of the forest, collapsing against a tree. But the chanting followed him. When he looked back, the lanterns were there, floating like malevolent eyes in the darkness. He ran again, the town's lights just visible in the distance. But before he could reach them, a hand grabbed his shoulder, pulling him back. The next morning, the townspeople spoke in hushed tones about the disappearance of Father Andrew. Bishop Renato led the morning mass, his sermon filled with hope and reverence. The congregation listened intently, their faces serene. At the altar, the obsidian surface gleamed, the symbol at its center pulsing faintly, as if alive. Deep within the cathedral's catacombs, hidden behind stone walls, Father Andrew screamed, but no one could hear him. In the small town of Everbrook, the Church of St. Mercy's was the heart of the community. Its towering steeple could be seen from miles away, and its bells rang out every Sunday morning, calling the faithful to worship. For decades, Father Callahan had been its shepherd, a kind, quiet man whose sermons always spoke of compassion and forgiveness. No one ever questioned the occasional disappearances in Everbrook. After all, people left small towns all the time, chasing dreams in the big city. Life moved on, and St. Mercy's bells continued to chime. But for a group of curious kids, everything changed on a warm summer evening when they stumbled upon the town's darkest secret. It was Danny's idea. At 13, he was the oldest and always the ringleader of their mischief. That evening, he convinced Sarah, Max, and Joey to explore the church after dark. "It's creepy at night," Danny said with a grin, holding up a flashlight. "Bet none of you are brave enough to go inside." Sarah rolled her eyes. "The church isn't scary, Danny. It's just a building." Max and Joey exchanged nervous glances, but didn't dare back out. They didn't want to look like cowards in front of Danny. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the group had snuck out of their homes and met near the church. Its towering silhouette loomed over them, its stained glass windows dark and foreboding. The main doors were locked, but Danny had come prepared. He led the group to a side entrance, a door Father Callahan always used to access the rectory. The lock was old and rusty, and after a few hard shoves, it creaked open. Inside, the church was eerily silent. Their flashlights cast long shadows on the stone walls, and every sound they made seemed amplified in the cavernous space. "Let's check out the altar," Danny whispered, leading the way. The altar was draped in white cloth, its candles unlit. Behind it stood a massive crucifix, its wooden figure of Christ looming over them. "This isn't so scary," Sarah said, her voice echoing slightly. But then Joey froze, his flashlight shaking, as he pointed it toward a side door near the altar. "What's that smell?" he asked. The others sniffed the air. It was faint but unmistakable. A sickly, metallic tang. Danny grinned nervously. Maybe it's a rat or something. Rats don't smell like that, Sarah muttered. Curiosity got the better of them, and they pushed open the door. It led to a narrow hallway that connected to the church's basement. The smell grew stronger as they descended the creaking wooden stairs, their flashlights flickering in the damp air. At the bottom, they found themselves in a storage room, lined with dusty shelves holding old hymnals and candlesticks. But in the corner was a heavy wooden door, slightly ajar. Danny pushed it open, and they all gasped. The room beyond was small and dimly lit by a single flickering bulb. In the center was a table, and on it lay a body. It was a young woman, her lifeless eyes staring at the ceiling. Her arms were tied to the table with frayed ropes, and her dress was stained with blood. Around her neck was a rosary, the beads twisted tight enough to leave marks on her pale skin. Sarah stumbled back, covering her mouth to stifle a scream. Joey clutched Max's arm, his flashlight dropping to the ground. We need to go, Max stammered, his voice trembling. But Danny was frozen, his eyes locked on the body. Who would do this? He whispered. Before anyone could answer, they heard footsteps above them. The group scrambled to hide, pressing themselves against the shelves in the storage room. The footsteps grew louder, descending the stairs with slow, deliberate precision. From their hiding spot, they saw Father Callahan enter the room. He was dressed in his clerical robes, a lantern in one hand and a large knife in the other. His face, always so kind and serene, was twisted into a cold mask of purpose. Danny's breath hitched as Callahan approached the body. The priest murmured something under his breath, a prayer perhaps, and then raised the knife. The kids watched in horror as he began to carve into the woman's skin, his movements methodical and detached. Joey couldn't take it. He let out a small whimper, and Callahan's head snapped up. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. The kids froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. Callahan stepped away from the table, his lantern casting long shadows as he searched the room. Danny motioned for the others to move, pointing toward the stairs. They crept as quietly as they could, but as they reached the bottom step, Joey tripped, sending a stack of hymnals crashing to the floor. Callahan turned, his eyes narrowing. "You shouldn't be here." The kids bolted up the stairs, their screams echoing through the church. Callahan was close behind, his footsteps heavy and relentless. They burst into the nave, the flickering light of their flashlights barely illuminating the dark space. "This way!" Danny shouted, leading them toward the side entrance. But Callahan was faster. He appeared in front of them, his face calm, but his eyes burning with fury. "You don't understand," he said, his voice eerily calm. "I'm saving them, cleansing their sins." "You're a monster!" Sarah screamed. Callahan's lips curled into a smile. "We all have our roles to play." Danny grabbed a candlestick from a nearby shelf and swung it, narrowly missing Callahan's head. The priest lunged, his knife glinting in the dim light, but the kids scattered, splitting up as they ran for their lives. Sarah and Joey made it out through the side door, their screams fading into the night. Max and Danny ran toward the main doors, finding them still locked. "Come on!" Max yelled, pulling Danny toward a stained glass window. With all his strength, Danny threw the candlestick, shattering the glass. They climbed through, the shards slicing their hands as they tumbled onto the ground outside. The kids regrouped near the edge of the churchyard, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Callahan didn't follow. Instead, they saw him standing in the shattered window, his face illuminated by the pale moonlight. "You can't run from the truth," he called out, his voice carrying through the night. "God sees all." The kids didn't stop running until they reached the police station. When the authorities raided the church the next morning, they found the body in the basement, just as the kids had described. But Father Callahan was gone. The story made headlines, and the town of Everbrook was left to grapple with the horrifying truth. Their beloved priest had been a killer, hiding in plain sight for years. But the kids knew the truth ran deeper. In their nightmares, they still saw his face in the window, his chilling words echoing in their minds. "You can't run from the truth." And somewhere in the shadows, Father Callahan was waiting.